Camilla's name had never been neutral inside the royal family. It carried memories, accusations, whispered loyalties, and wounds that no ceremony could erase. For Charles, defending her was an act of devotion. For Harry, it felt like the final betrayal of his mother. To Charles, Camilla represented the person who had remained beside him when the monarchy felt cold, judgmental, and impossible to satisfy. He saw years of loyalty, patience, and quiet endurance. He believed she had survived public anger without demanding sympathy, standing close when others stepped away. But Harry carried a completely different truth. To him, Camilla's presence could never be separated from the confusion of his childhood, the tension hidden behind closed doors, and the painful knowledge that adults around him always seemed to understand more than they were willing to explain. Those memories had never disappeared. They had simply been buried beneath ceremonies, formal greetings, and the polished language of royal unity. Harry remembered absences that no one discussed, conversations that stopped when he entered a room, and questions answered with silence. He had grown older, but the child inside him still remembered how easily pain could be disguised as duty. Charles believed the family could not survive forever with Camilla blamed for every broken relationship, every failure of his marriage, and every mistake made by the institution during Diana's most difficult years. In his mind, defending Camilla was not an attack on Diana. It was an attempt to end a punishment that had lasted long enough. He wanted the family to accept that the past could not control the future. Harry saw something far more dangerous. He believed moving forward was being used as another name for forgetting. Accepting Camilla's position was one thing. Accepting a softened version of Diana's suffering was another. He could tolerate ceremony, but he could not tolerate the idea that peace required silence from Diana's sons. That was the unspoken royal rule Harry had resisted for years. Private pain must eventually surrender to institutional stability. Memories could be honored, but only if they did not threaten the authority of the sovereign. Grief could exist, but it had to remain controlled. And now, Charles was framing his defense of Camilla as protection of the monarchy itself, making disagreement sound dangerously close to disloyalty. The longer Charles spoke, the more Harry began to suspect that the meeting had never been arranged to hear him. It had been arranged to contain him. He was not being invited to express his anger. He was being warned where the boundaries now stood, especially when it came to what he might say about Camilla beyond palace walls. The aides outside understood the risk before either man admitted it. If Harry left believing Charles had chosen Camilla's protection over Diana's memory, reconciliation would become almost impossible. Charles saw his words as overdue justice. Harry heard them as the slow erasure of his mother. And as Harry walked deeper into the palace corridors, one sentence continued to follow him, the sentence Charles had spoken about loyalty, sacrifice, and the woman Harry could never separate from Diana's suffering. It was not Charles's raised voice that drove Harry from the room. It was one carefully chosen sentence, quiet, controlled, and devastating. In a few words, Charles appeared to elevate Camilla's loyalty above Diana's pain, and Harry knew he could not remain seated. Charles had spoken with the calm certainty of a man who believed the argument had already been settled. Camilla, he declared, had remained beside him when others judged him, misunderstood him, and walked away. She had endured years of hostility without abandoning her place, and he would no longer allow anyone, not even his own son, to question what that loyalty had cost her. To Charles, the statement was a defense. To Harry, it sounded like an accusation aimed at someone who could no longer answer. The meaning Harry heard beneath those words was unbearable. If Camilla had stayed when others had failed Charles, then where did that leave Diana? Was his father suggesting that she had not understood the burden of being married to the future king? That her unhappiness had been weakness? That her refusal to remain silent had made her less loyal than the woman now seated beside the throne? Harry felt the old anger rise again. Royal history, he had learned, was rarely preserved without alteration. It was shaped by those who remained alive, protected by those still holding power, and repeated until memory became official truth. The dead could be praised, honored, and mourned, but they could not interrupt. They could not challenge the language chosen for them. Diana could no longer explain why silence had become impossible. Harry rejected the idea that loyalty should be judged by obedience alone. To him, loyalty without honesty was surrender. Silence was not always dignity. Sometimes it was fear, isolation, or the final price demanded by an institution that valued appearances above suffering. Charles did not retreat. Duty, he insisted, required endurance. Camilla had survived ridicule, rejection, and public anger without turning against the crown. She had absorbed years of blame and continued to serve. That, Charles believed, deserved recognition. But Harry made a darker comparison. Diana had also endured. The difference, in his mind, was that her pain had eventually become visible, and once it could no longer be controlled, the institution had treated her honesty as danger. Those who remained useful were protected. Those whose suffering exposed the system were pushed aside. The conflict then moved beyond Camilla. It touched Diana's letters, her personal belongings, the jewels tied to her public image, and the question of who would control how she was remembered. Charles argued that history could not remain frozen around tragedy. Harry feared that moving forward meant removing every truth that made the past uncomfortable. Leaving the room became more than an escape. It was Harry's refusal to approve the version of history Charles was asking him to accept. Yet behind the closed door, Charles remained still. Pride held him there. Kingship held him there, and his determination to protect Camilla stopped him from calling his son back. The argument might have remained a painful clash between father and son until Harry discovered that Charles's defense of Camilla was connected to a far more sensitive question involving Diana's possessions and the future of the royal collection. The argument was never only about words. Behind Charles's defense of Camilla stood a quieter battle over Diana's jewels, private letters, ceremonial pieces, and the right to decide how her memory would be presented. Harry soon realized the past was being reorganized without his approval. What first appeared to be a private disagreement between father and son had already reached deeper into the machinery of the monarchy. Behind closed doors, an internal review was examining jewels, gifts, letters, and heirlooms connected to Diana. Some had been inherited personally. Others belonged to the wider royal collection, where emotional meaning carried less weight than legal ownership, tradition, and royal precedent. Harry learned that several pieces strongly associated with his mother could be reassigned, displayed under different descriptions, or placed inside a new historical presentation. The stated purpose was continuity. The family story would no longer be told through scandal and division, but through survival, duty, and the endurance of the crown. Yet Harry immediately sensed what that softer language could conceal. Rumors suggested that Camilla's household supported a sharper distinction between Diana's private belongings and objects considered permanent property of the monarchy. On paper, the difference sounded reasonable. To Harry, it felt cold. A jewel worn by Diana might technically belong to the crown, but to millions of people, and especially to her sons, it carried her presence, her suffering, and the memory of a woman whose life had been shaped by the institution now deciding how she should be remembered. Harry feared that the review would give the palace power to separate Diana into convenient versions. She could be remembered as a loving mother, when emotion was useful, honored as a princess during anniversaries, and quietly reduced when her story threatened the stability of the present reign. Charles rejected that suspicion. Historically important pieces, he argued, could not remain trapped inside unresolved grief. They had to be managed according to tradition, not private emotion. But the argument became more dangerous when attention turned to one unnamed jewel, a piece believed to carry personal meaning for Diana's sons while also holding deep symbolic value for the monarchy. Harry began to wonder whether Camilla might one day wear it, display it, or oversee its place within the royal collection. The possibility felt almost unthinkable. Charles insisted Camilla was replacing no one. As queen, he said, she required access to objects connected to her role, regardless of who had worn them before. William was left between two worlds. He understood Harry's pain, yet he also recognized the legal complications surrounding royal property. His caution only deepened Harry's suspicion that discussions had already moved forward without him. Suddenly, Harry's departure no longer looked impulsive. He believed Charles's defense of Camilla had been preparing him for something larger. Decisions that could permanently reshape Diana's legacy while leaving her sons powerless to stop it. But the jewels were only the visible symbols of the conflict, because the real struggle concerned something even more dangerous inside the monarchy, the power to decide which version of the past would become official. Royal history is rarely erased in a single dramatic act. It is softened, rearranged, and repeated until one version becomes official. Harry feared that Charles's defense of Camilla was part of a larger transformation, one that would leave Diana honored in public but powerless in the story. The monarchy had always understood the power of presentation. Painful chapters were not removed completely. That would create suspicion. Instead, they were managed through carefully planned anniversaries, controlled exhibitions, approved biographies, formal speeches, and ceremonial language that sounded respectful while revealing very little. Letters could be selected. Photographs could be placed in a certain order. Difficult years could be reduced to a few polished sentences. Over time, the version repeated most often became the version future generations accepted. Charles wanted that official story to focus on survival. His relationship with Camilla, once seen as a source of scandal, would be presented as a bond that endured judgment, separation, and public hostility. In his eyes, the monarchy had survived the crisis, and Camilla had remained beside him through its consequences. The story, therefore, should end not in disgrace, but in duty. Harry feared what such a conclusion required. Diana might still be praised as a devoted mother and a beloved princess, but the anger, loneliness, and conflict that defined her private suffering could slowly disappear. She would remain emotionally powerful, yet politically harmless, a tragic figure honored by the same institution whose failures would never be examined too closely. Palace planners were believed to favor language that treated Diana with dignity while avoiding direct questions about her marriage, her isolation, and the choices made around her. Camilla's supporters considered that restraint necessary. No queen, they argued, could perform her role while permanently treated as a lesser figure living beneath the shadow of her husband's former wife. But Harry saw the danger immediately. For Camilla to receive full historical legitimacy, the damage surrounding her rise might need to be softened. The sharper edges of Diana's story would have to be filed down until forgiveness appeared natural and accountability no longer seemed urgent. Charles viewed Harry's resistance as something deeply unfair. He believed his son was denying everyone else the right to redemption. Harry saw the opposite. To him, Charles was demanding forgiveness while refusing to admit the full cost of what had happened. William understood both sides, and that made his position even more difficult. He knew the monarchy could not remain trapped forever inside the conflicts of the past. Yet he also understood that Diana's memory still shaped public affection for her sons and for the future of the crown. The tension intensified when Harry learned of a confidential proposal for a royal exhibition or commemorative event placing Diana, Charles, and Camilla inside one carefully controlled narrative. To the palace, it promised reconciliation through history. To Harry, it threatened to turn a painful human struggle into an approved institutional story. His departure from Charles's room now carried a larger meaning. He had not simply walked away from a defense of Camilla. He had rejected a version of the past he believed would honor Diana's name, while silencing everything she had suffered. Yet Charles was facing pressures Harry could not see. Because behind the emotional argument stood advisors warning that Camilla's authority and perhaps the stability of the reign itself could not survive another public attack from within the family. Charles had spent years waiting to defend Camilla without apology. Now, as king, he believed silence would signal weakness, but in protecting the crown and the queen beside him, he made a choice Harry had feared since childhood. The institution came before the son. Long before Harry entered the room, senior advisors had warned Charles that the conflict could no longer be treated as a private family wound. Every public criticism of Camilla, they argued, weakened more than her reputation. It threatened her authority during ceremonies, complicated her position across Commonwealth duties, and raised uncomfortable questions about how much respect the Queen could command inside the family itself. Charles listened because the warning touched his deepest fear. If he remained silent, the attacks would continue. More interviews could follow. More private conversations might become public. Documentaries, memoirs, and carefully timed revelations could once again place Camilla at the center of a royal crisis. To Charles, defending her was no longer optional. It had become part of defending the structure around the throne. That was why he entered the meeting with a boundary already fixed. Harry could speak about his childhood. He could describe his pain, anger, and sense of abandonment. But he would not be allowed to challenge Camilla's legitimacy or suggest that her position beside the king remained open to judgment. Harry rejected that distinction. He did not believe he was attacking Camilla merely as a person. He believed he was questioning the system that had protected certain people while Diana suffered in isolation. To him, separating Camilla from that system was impossible. Her title, security, jewels, public role, and access to royal power were all connected to decisions made during the most painful years of his mother's life. Charles understood some of that pain. Beneath the authority of the crown remained a father carrying private guilt. Yet when the moment demanded tenderness, he chose the language of duty. He spoke of stability, service, loyalty, and the damage caused by continued division. Harry had come seeking acknowledgement. Charles had come seeking acceptance. Neither man was prepared to give the other what he needed. Camilla was not inside the room, but her presence controlled it. Every unresolved issue returned to her: the respect attached to her title, the protection of her reputation, the future of royal jewels, and her place within the monarchy's official history. When Harry stood and left, Charles did not follow. Calling him back might have looked like retreat after a royal boundary had been declared. So the king remained seated, trapped by the authority he had chosen to display. Harry heard only silence behind him. To him, it confirmed everything. Charles was willing to let his son walk away rather than reconsider the defense he had made. Outside, aides were already preparing for the consequences. Future invitations, family appearances, inheritance discussions, and access to royal residences could all be affected by the failure of one conversation. And while Charles remained behind the closed door, Harry was approaching someone whose response could decide whether the argument stayed private or became a permanent division: his brother William. William had spent years balancing two loyalties, protecting Diana's memory and preparing to inherit the crown Charles now defended. But when Harry revealed what had been said about Camilla, William could no longer remain safely between father, brother, and institution. Harry reached out while the anger was still fresh. He did not offer a careful summary or soften the words Charles had used. He repeated the sentence exactly as he remembered it, expecting William to hear the same hidden insult, the same painful suggestion that Camilla's endurance somehow carried more value than Diana's suffering. Harry believed his brother would understand immediately. After all, they had shared the same loss, the same unanswered questions, and the same childhood shaped by adults who spoke in guarded phrases. William was disturbed. He understood why the comparison felt cruel, even if Charles had not spoken Diana's name directly. But he also believed Harry's decision to leave had ended the conversation at the worst possible moment. Walking away, William argued, had given Charles no reason to explain himself and no opportunity to hear how deeply his words had landed. That answer only hardened Harry's suspicion. He accused William of becoming too comfortable with palace compromise. The closer William moved toward the throne, Harry suggested, the more willing he appeared to accept decisions their mother would once have challenged. It was no longer enough, Harry said, to honor Diana in speeches while remaining silent when her history was being reshaped. William refused the accusation. Protecting their mother's memory, he insisted, did not require turning every dispute with Charles or Camilla into a permanent war. There were battles that could be fought privately, through influence, patience, and careful pressure. But Harry no longer trusted that approach. To him, private influence was simply another promise that the truth would be addressed later, after the palace had already made its decision. Their disagreement became a clash over strategy. Harry believed truth lost its meaning when consequences determined whether it could be spoken. William believed public exposure destroyed the very access needed to change anything from within. Then William issued a warning. If Harry openly threatened Camilla's position, Charles would close ranks around her. Discussions involving Diana's letters, possessions, jewels, and official legacy would become even more restricted. That warning revealed more than William intended. Harry asked whether his brother had already been consulted about the disputed pieces and the proposed historical presentation. William hesitated. It lasted only a moment, but for Harry, it was enough. He saw confirmation that decisions had been unfolding without him. William explained that some objects emotionally linked to Diana still belonged legally or ceremonially to the monarchy. Personal meaning could not erase royal ownership. Harry heard only the language of the institution taking control again. The conversation ended without agreement. But before it did, William delivered one final warning. If Harry repeated Charles's private words publicly, the family might never again trust him behind a closed door. Harry now faced a choice more dangerous than the argument itself: remain silent and watch the palace control the story, or reveal why Charles's defense of Camilla had driven him from the room. Harry's departure lasted only seconds, but its consequences threatened to shape years. Behind him stood a father defending his queen, a brother protecting the future crown, and a palace guarding its secrets. Ahead of him was one final decision: silence, surrender, or exposure. As the anger began to settle, a harder question took its place. Had leaving the room protected Harry, or had it handed Charles control of the story? The palace could now present the failed meeting in whatever language best served the crown. Harry's silence might be described not as heartbreak, but as refusal. His departure could be framed as proof that he had arrived unwilling to listen, unable to compromise, and determined to turn private pain into another royal crisis. That possibility disturbed him. For Harry, revealing what Charles had said would not be only an act of revenge. It could be a way of stopping the palace from softening the confrontation until its true meaning disappeared. If he remained silent, the official version might say that tempers had risen over ordinary family disagreements. It would not explain the painful comparison he believed Charles had made between Camilla's loyalty and Diana's suffering. Yet those closest to Harry warned him that public exposure carried a brutal price. Repeating the king's private words could destroy what remained of reconciliation. It would also strengthen the palace's deepest accusation, that Harry could not be trusted with confidential conversations, no matter how emotional or important they were. Charles's household was already preparing its defense. The message would be firm. The king supported open discussion of Harry's experiences, but Camilla's legitimacy was not open to negotiation. Personal attacks against the queen would be treated as attacks on the stability of the reign itself. When Camilla learned what had happened, her reaction was far from simple. Part of her felt relief that Charles had defended her without hesitation. She had waited years for that certainty. But another part understood the cost. His words may have protected her position while pushing Harry farther away than either of them had intended. William urged restraint. He knew a public battle over Diana and Camilla would not remain contained between three people. It would reopen the monarchy's most painful chapter before a new generation, forcing every jewel, letter, ceremony, and old accusation back into the center of public attention. And the disputed possessions had still not been settled. The jewels, archival plans, and future exhibitions remained unresolved, guaranteeing that the conflict would return through inheritance decisions, commemorations, and moments when history had to be displayed. Harry finally understood that the deepest argument was not about whether Charles loved Camilla. It was whether that love required everyone else to accept Charles's version of the past. Charles understood something equally painful. By defending Camilla as king, he may have lost the chance to reach Harry as a father. Still, he would not withdraw his words, and so the moment remained suspended between them. Harry walking away, Charles refusing to rise, each waiting for the other to turn back, and neither willing to surrender what he believed loyalty demanded.